I've never been a superstitious person in my entire life. I always walked on cracks in the pavement. I always used to open umbrellas indoors before heading out into the rain. I never used to worry about breaking mirrors. And I always used to make a point of walking under ladders whenever I saw them. I always saw myself as lucky and didn't need to concern myself with such things. Until that day, I was the most confident person you could ever choose to meet. Now, it's a constant struggle to even leave the house, in case it ever happens again. I used to work in central London for one of the big banks. I'd always wanted to feel important. When I was younger, and my father used to take me on trips into the city, I'd see people with smart suits, briefcases, and even on some rare occasions, bowler hats. I'd see them stood in a line, waiting for the underground train, or tube as we call it in London, usually reading a large newspaper. They had this aura about them, and I'd ask my dad why they were dressed like that. They're very important business people, he would say. They help to keep this city and the country running. I'd just stare at them in amazement. They looked so different to everyone else that was waiting for the train. A lot of people would just be wearing trainers, t-shirts and comfortable clothes like me. But these people looked so sophisticated. It was as if I'd stepped back in time. My dad was my hero, but I wanted to be like them when I was older. And so, years later, with my degree in economics, I managed to get my foot in the door at a large international bank, with their headquarters in the centre of London. As anyone who's lived in London will tell you, it's near impossible to get a place to live in the city centre without sacrificing your life savings. So I had a very modest studio apartment on the outskirts of London. It still cost a lot of money, mind you, but something I was able to afford on my salary. I'd been working my way up the ladder for a couple of years now, and I'd built myself quite a good reputation. I was proud of what I'd achieved so far. That morning, I woke up to my 6 a.m. alarm as usual, brushed my teeth, and turned on the TV to watch the news. Efficiency was one of my core beliefs, so I used this time to also spend 15 minutes on my exercise bike while eating breakfast cereal. It pained me to have any wasted time, and I needed to do things as efficiently as possible. I'd gotten this to be a fine art, being so automatic that I didn't even have to think about it anymore. As the newscaster droned on, I took none of it in. All I could think about today, the same as any other day, was my day ahead. How can I make myself more successful? How can I be the best? How can I win? You see, it was all about me. And as you're about to find out, that's a dangerous attitude to have. Putting on my slate grey pinstripe suit, paired with a silver tie, I looked at myself in the full body mirror I had in my bedroom. Impeccable. I love to look smart. I guess it helped me to feel better than anyone else. Glancing at the clock, I realised that it was now time to leave the house. So I grabbed a piece of fruit from the counter before heading out of the door. It was a short walk to the underground station. Thankfully, it was a bright summer day, so it felt good to stride down the road with my head held high. I chose this area to live in specifically as it was quite an upmarket location. Lots of well-to-do people like me. It was a commuter town, so many people would leave their homes in the morning to travel into London. As I walked down the street, I saw a few others shut their front doors and leave for work too. But no one looked as good as me. As I turned the corner to go onto the street that led to my local underground station, my black wingtip shoes collided with something, causing me to stumble and drop my apple. It rolled into the gutter. It broke me out of my morning trance, thinking about the day ahead. I turned around in anger. Sitting there, cross-legged on the floor, on a ragged and dirty woolen blanket, was an old man. He had incredibly long grey hair, complete with a considerable silver beard. His skin was leathery, cracked and grubby. He clearly hadn't seen a bath in a very long time. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I yelled. The words came bursting from my mouth before I even had time to think. My indignance was automatic at this point. It was one of my many defence mechanisms. "I'm sorry, sir. I couldn't find a place to spend the night, you see." The old man couldn't even look at me. I looked down at him in disgust. "So you decided to sit there where someone could trip over you? I'm going to work, where I pay my taxes to support people like you. Couldn't you have found a shop doorway or something? Why can't you just stay out of the way and not bother anyone?" This neighbourhood had certain standards. I'd never seen someone like him here before. The old man turned to look at me, with a cold, dead stare. There was no anger in those eyes. In fact, I'm not sure I could see any emotion at all. It unnerved me. After a second or two, his lips began to move. "I used to be in your position, sir. Believe me, it can all change in a moment." I didn't know what to say to that. It took me completely by surprise. He continued staring at me, unmoving. After standing there for a few seconds, with a dumbfounded look on my face, my mind kicked in again. I'd be late for work. I dismissed the old man with a swipe of my hand and started jogging away from him towards the station. I didn't turn back, but I knew that he would still be staring at me with those cold grey eyes. As I rushed towards the underground station, my mind kept returning back to the encounter I'd just had. I tried to brush it off, but his words continued to echo around my mind. The look in his eyes also deeply unsettled me. It had that uncanny valley feeling, where your subconscious mind knows that something isn't right. But the logical side of my brain took over, as I dismissed them as the inane ramblings of a derelict. As luck would have it, I reached the platform just as my train pulled into the station. Pushing the incident to the back of my mind, I held the handrail and looked ahead to the rest of the day. I had more important things to worry about. The day at work went by in a blur of meetings and spreadsheets. It was a particularly problematic day, with a lot of issues to resolve. It was very rare that I actually left on time due to the pressure of the job, but today was much worse than normal. The quarterly performance reviews were coming up, and I couldn't afford to slack off for a moment. With my stomach grumbling due to a lack of food, I blinked my dry eyes for a few moments before glancing at the clock in the bottom corner of the screen. Somehow, it was nearly 9 p.m. Stretching out my arms, I glanced around the office, which was now illuminated by dull yellow lighting. Alone. I didn't have time to make friends where I worked. I wanted to climb the ladder. I wasn't here to make friends. I was here to make money. I must have been so engrossed in my work that I didn't notice the last few people leave. Oh well, no matter. By the time I left the office, the sun had set and the streets were bathed in the comforting orange glow of streetlights. Thankfully, it was still warm enough not to need a jacket. With my rumbling stomach urging me onwards, I hurried to the underground station. I wanted to get home and just put this day behind me. It had been full of stress and worry, especially after the way it started. A new worry crept into my mind. I wondered if I'd encounter the old man that I'd chastised this morning on the way home. Swiping through the gates, I jogged down the escalator to try and catch the train that was just arriving. I managed to leap through the open train doors just as they were closing, and and I had my pick of seats in an almost empty carriage. You mainly had commuters on this line, so it wasn't a surprise. For anyone that's been on a London Underground train before, you'd know that they can get quite loud. The train rattled and ground through the dark tunnels. I tried to look outside of the train, but all I could see was my own reflection against the stark blackness surrounding the carriage. My mind just couldn't switch off. I chalked it up to hunger as I'd skipped lunch. Trying to distract myself, I glanced around the carriage. The few other passengers were either dozing off due to exhaustion or engrossed in their phones. I tried to pass the time by checking my emails, but the screen's glow did little to dispel the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. I had at least half an hour to kill before I reached my home station, so I took the lead from the handful of passengers on the train and closed my eyes. I highly doubted I'd be able to fall asleep due to my mind going a million miles an hour, but at least I could rest my eyes, which were feeling scratchy and irritated from looking at a computer screen for 12 hours straight. The occasional sounds from the train actually did put me into a trance of sorts. It became kind of relaxing. The gentle and soothing automated announcements saying to mind the closing doors. The shuffle of other passengers' feet as they exited the train as it pulled into each station. The comforting and rhythmic clattering of the wheels on the track. The rocking motion of the train itself was even starting to relax me. It felt nice to switch off, just for a few minutes. We'd passed a few stations by this point, and I'd heard a few of my fellow passengers step onto the platforms to leave. I hadn't heard anyone get on, which made me wonder whether I was the only one left on the train. I slowly opened my eyes and adjusted to the bright lights of the carriage. There was one person left on the train, aside from me, sitting directly opposite me. It was the old man from this morning. He must have gotten on at one of the last stations without me noticing. His cold eyes met mine instantly, and a spike of terror ran through my body. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were locked onto mine, never breaking eye contact. I felt trapped, yet strangely compelled, unable to look away. I had nowhere to run, but I spotted an emergency stop button on the wall of the carriage. Should I? I dismissed the thought immediately. After all, what would I tell the driver? An old man at least 40 years older than me was on the train and scared me just by sitting down? It was a ridiculous notion. He was no threat to me. I was better than him in every way. No doubt he just wanted to scare me. He'd likely been waiting on that platform all day. He wouldn't dare try anything. There was CCTV on these trains. As I tried my best to avoid his gaze and simply ignore him, the old man's simple presence began to grow suffocating, and the air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. It was almost imperceptible over the rattle of the train, but he began to hum a low, mournful tune that began to reverberate through the carriage. I tried to focus on my phone, but I discovered that my hands were shaking too much to type. Do you still think that you're untouchable? His voice cut through the ambient noise of the train like a knife. I opened my mouth to try and respond to him, but my voice was paralysed. I couldn't produce any words. The old man then leaned forward, his grey eyes boring into mine. You think you're better than everyone else. You think you're safe, but you're wrong. As the last word left his mouth, the halogen lights in the carriage began to flicker before going out completely, plunging us into complete darkness. I found myself frozen in place due to fear and panic, and my breathing became rapid and laboured. After what seemed like an eternity, the lights came back on, and I quickly realised with horror that the man was no longer sitting opposite me. He was now sitting right next to me. My feet were still locked to the floor in fear. His cold breath brushed against my ear as he whispered, "You will learn." And with that, the lights in the carriage cut out yet again, leaving me with that sentence echoing in my head, all while the train screeched through the tunnel. Adrenaline finally kicked in, and I leapt up out of my seat, backing up to the wall at the end of the carriage. With my chest heaving and my heart pounding, I wanted nothing more than to wake up from this nightmare. I must have dozed off. I'm dreaming. This can't be real. Then, just as suddenly as they went out, the lights buzzed back into life. To my confusion, I was now completely alone in the carriage. There was no sign of the old man. The adrenaline coursing through my veins had now forced logic to depart and for me to take leave of my senses. Without thought, I raised the protective door of the passenger emergency alarm on the wall and pulled the lever. As I braced, expecting the train to grind to a halt, it never came. The train continued to travel on its course, and nothing happened. I pulled continuously on the lever in desperation, but it was useless. I let out a scream of anguish. I then realised that I was in the first passenger carriage of the train. The next one would be the driver's carriage. I rushed over to the driver's door, which was a solid and sealed piece of thick metal, and pounded away at it with my fists, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Help! Please help!" My voice must have been drowned out slightly by the noise of the train, but there was no way you couldn't hear me. I must have hammered at that door for 5 minutes, but to no avail. I was trapped in here. I just had to hope that this was some terrible dream, and I'd wake up soon. My back slid against the door, and I sat in defeat on the floor. After a few moments, the speaker for announcements began to crackle. The prolonged static filled the air, and due to my panic-induced state, it became the only thing I could hear. In between the crisp and stark hissing emanating from the speakers, a low and distorted voice could be heard. It took a moment for me to realise what it was saying, but in a monotone manner it was saying, "End of the line. End of the line." The distorted voice continued to drone, repeating the phrase over and over. I was in utter disbelief that this was happening. I tried pinching myself awake and slapping myself across the face. This had to be a dream, it just had to be. But the crackling static against the rattle of the train continued to bombard my ears. The train showed no signs of stopping. As I clamped my eyes shut and held my hands over my face, I yearned to be back home. I started to regret even leaving the house this morning. Just as I thought all hope was lost, I felt a strong judder run through the train, and it began to slow down. I leapt to my feet and ran to the doors. I didn't care at this point where I ended up. All I knew is that I had to get off of this cursed train. I saw the darkness outside the carriage give way to a dull light as we drew into the platform. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. Stepping out onto the platform, I could see it was completely deserted. The sign on the wall read, "End of the line," just as the distorted announcement had said. There were no words coming out of the speaker, but I could still hear a distinct static in the air. I could barely see much on the platform itself. It was dimly lit, with the flickering fluorescent lights casting long and unsettling shadows on the walls. The air in this place also seemed thick and musty. It had clearly been long abandoned. As I cautiously walked down the platform, I could see that the station was in disrepair. Tattered old advertisements plastered the walls. I'm sure I could even see products that hadn't been around since World War II. Old newspapers were being swept down the tunnels by the wind. I managed to grab one with my hand. The date read, Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. The headline in uppercase font read, Britain at War. It felt like I'd stepped back in time. As I passed through the arch leading out of the platform, tentatively looking around as I went, I looked up and down the main concourse. The tiles on the stairs leading upwards were cracked and broken, and the ticket barriers were rusted. It was as if the place had been abandoned for decades. I looked everywhere in that place, trying to find an exit, some way to escape, but to no avail. What I imagined was the main exit was blocked off by a mountain of rubble, as if the entranceway had collapsed. All I found was a labyrinth of corridors and stairwells, which only led to dead ends. Panic began to set in yet again, as I came to the realization that I was trapped in this godforsaken place. I grabbed my phone from my pocket in desperation. No signal. I was alone, and there was no one that could help me. As I reached yet another dead end, I hammered against it with my fist in frustration. What on earth was I going to do? I just wanted to be safe at home. I just wanted to leave this place, whatever or wherever it was. Exhausted and deflated, I slumped against the cold wall of the corridor. All hope was lost. Then, breaking through the overwhelming silence, I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound. My heart leapt into my throat. I remained completely still, frozen in fear, like I was on the train carriage moments before. I tried to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. The noise began to grow louder, echoing off the walls. And I eventually realised it was coming from the direction of the platform where I arrived. The sound was strangely rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but they were slow and uneven, as if someone or something was dragging themselves towards me. The familiar feeling of adrenaline returned, and I jolted myself upwards. I needed to find somewhere to hide. I stumbled down the nearest corridor. There was no way I could disguise or hide my footsteps in this place. Every step reverberated as if I was banging a drum. It made me wince. As I turned a corner, I spotted my salvation. There was a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. Without a thought, I bolted towards it, as if my body was moving of its own accord. This was about survival now. I shoved the rusted door open with all of my might, causing it to creak loudly on its hinges, and slipped inside. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I was almost hyperventilating by this point. As I glanced around, from what I could see, the room was cramped and dark. I could just about make out the shapes of old maintenance equipment and rusted tools. My ears attuned to the noises outside the door. I could still hear the terrifying shuffling, but to my horror, it was now accompanied by a faint, rasping breath. As I could feel a scream building in my chest, I had to force myself to stay quiet. I had to stay hidden, away from this thing. I clamped my eyes shut. I stayed motionless as I heard the shuffling slowly move past the door. It stopped for a brief moment right outside, and all I could hear was the raspy and laboured breathing from before. To be honest, it sounded like a death rattle. I realised that I'd stopped breathing out of fear. Moments later, the shuffling started again, and it moved away from the door. I breathed a sigh of relief and opened my eyes. "You cannot escape your fate." The words made me jump out of my skin. A smell of rot and decay filled my nostrils, as I could see the faint outline of a person directly in front of me in the room. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but there was no mistaking that voice. It was the old man that had been plaguing me all day. The low, raspy voice reverberated off the walls. "You think you can run, but the past always catches up with you." I instinctively tried to back away, but there was nowhere I could go. My back was pressed against the cold steel door, and he shuffled towards me. "Please," I begged, "leave me alone." As my eyes began to adjust to the light, I could see him raise his hand. With that, I felt an invisible force grip me, pulling me further towards him. The strength of the hold on me was ironclad, inhuman. I struggled in vain, but it was no use. My body began to levitate off the ground, and I found myself suspended in midair. "You must understand," he said, "that your sheer arrogance and disregard for others has led you here, to this place. You believed yourself to be invincible, but now you see the truth. You're just like the rest of us, vulnerable and afraid." My heart was beating out of my chest. In between the sheer panic and the hyperventilation, I could feel my consciousness slipping away, fading to black. "You will learn humility," the old man whispered with a guttural rattle, "and you will never forget, lest you wish to find yourself in this place again and become another lost soul." With those words, everything went dark. I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring at me, as usual. My clothes were drenched in sweat, and I could see that I was wearing the same clothes as yesterday. To my amazement, I was back in my apartment, lying in bed. Was it just a dream? Surely not. It was so real. I got ready for work in a daze, but my mind kept replaying the terrifying events over and over again. I was in utter disbelief. It had to be real. It just had to be. I couldn't bring myself to get the underground again, so I called myself a cab. It would cost me a ridiculous sum of money, but I wasn't sure I could step foot in an underground station again. As the taxi started its journey, I couldn't help but nervously glance around, half expecting to see the old man again. But he was nowhere to be found, to my immense relief. When I eventually arrived at the office, my colleagues immediately noticed a change in me. I was no longer the self-assured businessman that they'd known. I kept to myself all day, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. I was a broken man. As the day went on, I started to think that it must have been a dream. I hadn't seen the old man all day, and the nightmares of the previous night began to seem more and more unlikely. We've all had nightmares that have felt so real, only to wake up the following morning with things back to normal. I was almost back to my normal self as I came back home that night. I ran up the stairwell and approached my apartment, but I saw something sitting on the doormat that defied explanation. A tattered and aged newspaper. The date read Sunday, September 3rd, 1939, with the all too familiar headline, Britain at War. Wide-eyed as the realisation hit me, I glanced around frantically before locking myself in my apartment. That was 15 years ago now. Many years may have passed, but I'm still a changed man. I was fired from my high-paying job at the bank. After finding that newspaper, I became a hermit for weeks. I couldn't bring myself to leave the house, and unsurprisingly, that didn't sit well with them. I couldn't even tell them what had happened, or they likely would have had me committed. After I'd gathered up the courage to be able to leave my home, I informed my landlord that I wouldn't be able to stay there any longer. I moved to a small town in the country, far away from the city. I work in a baker's now. It doesn't pay well, but it's honest work. I've even found a partner, and we've been blessed with a child. I always have to make an excuse if they want to go on a trip to the city, though. I could never go back. In a strange way, looking back, I'm happy that I had that experience all those years ago. I'm happier. Although, there's something that helps to keep me on the straight and narrow, to stop me slipping back into old habits. Every year, on the anniversary of those horrible events, I find something on my doorstep the following morning. A tattered, old newspaper.